Every once in a while, you uncover a technique so effective, so far ahead of its time, that it forces you to re-evaluate what you thought you knew about medieval engineering. Throughout Northern Europe, fragments of forgotten structures keep surfacing. Foundation posts, still solid after 600 years. Barn beams unrotted despite centuries of damp climate, and storage vessels intact long after the societies that used them faded. Archaeologists kept finding these anomalies, yet the written records describing the method behind them had vanished. It wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when rural craftsmen were interviewed in remote regions, that clues began to emerge. What we now call a lost preservation technique wasn't truly lost. It was suppressed, discouraged, and replaced by industrial-era substitutes. And today we're going back to it step by step, because modern builders, survivalists and homesteaders are starting to recognize its raw effectiveness. The method begins by harvesting wood at a time when nature naturally protects it. Medieval carpenters knew that sap was the enemy. Sap fed insects, fungi and bacteria. It invited moisture, and so they deliberately harvested timber during the coldest months of winter, usually after the first hard freeze. During that period, the tree reduces its sap circulation, leaving the wood denser, drier, and far less vulnerable to rot. The moment the tree was felled, the bark was removed while the fibres were still pliable, reducing moisture retention even further. This wasn't superstition. The practice is so effective that you can test it yourself. If you cut a log in winter and store it upright under shelter for 10 to 14 days, then strip the bark. You will notice how clean the grain looks and how quickly the surface firms up compared to wood felled in summer. You know, this simple step alone can give you a 50% increase in lifespan for posts, beams or tool handles. The shaping process itself worked as a built-in defense system, really. Medieval beams weren't round. They were squared, hewn, and faced deliberately. When carpenters removed the sap-rich outer layers using axes and adzes, they exposed the strong heartwood, which contained natural rot-resistant compounds. But the technique went deeper than that. By hewing the surface into broad, flat planes, they altered the way water interacted with the wood. Rain shed faster, seepage was minimized, and the sides dried evenly. Even the angled cuts served a purpose. They prevented pooling and stopped water from being wicked back into the grain. Anyone wanting to recreate the method on their homestead can follow the same logic. Strip the bark, square the log until you see tight grain. Shape the sides so water drains off rather than collecting. This costs nothing but effort, yet it drastically extends the durability of any wooden structure you build. The core of the technique, and the reason it was later discouraged, involved controlled charring. This is the step that makes historians pause, because it appears across unrelated cultures, often forbidden or regulated by authorities who feared the hazards of open flame. Medieval craftsmen burned the surface of beams, posts and containers just long enough to carbonize the outer fibres. Not enough to weaken the wood, but enough to create a protective, fire-sealed skin. The thin char layer repelled moisture, blocked fungi, and deterred insects. It also made the surface more dimensionally stable, reducing swelling and shrinkage. In Japan, the same method, yakisugi, was never lost. In parts of Scandinavia, old barns still stand with beams blackened from the process. But in many European regions, authorities banned open-flame treatment near towns and mills, and the practice faded. To apply it today, you simply use a handheld torch on a clean, dry wooden surface. Heat it until the wood turns evenly black. Brush off the powdery soot, and you'll be left with a smooth, carbon-sealed surface that resists decay for decades. The final strengthening came from saturating the charred layer with naturally derived oils and resins. This was the step that turned wood into a long-term storage material capable of outlasting leather, clay, or early metalwork. Medieval craftsmen heated pine tar, birch tar, linseed oil, or walnut oil until it became thin enough to penetrate the charred surface. The carbon acted like a sponge, pulling the oils deep into the grain. As the mixture cooled, it locked into place, creating a semi-polymeric shell, flexible enough to move with the wood, yet hard enough to repel water and insects. Archaeologists have found grain storage boxes sealed with pine tar still intact after centuries underground. Shipbuilders use the same compounds to waterproof hulls. You can replicate this by warming pine tar and linseed oil in equal parts, applying it with a stiff brush and letting it cure in the sun. When done properly, the result outperforms many modern sealants and remains non-toxic. You know, the reason the hack disappeared was actually rooted in economics, not in efficiency. By the 18th century, industrial mills really needed uniform wood that could be processed quickly. They just didn't want logs hewn by hand, charred on site, or well coated in tar that ended up clogging saw blades. Governments, for their part, discouraged open flame treatment. Tar makers became regulated and sawmills pushed for standardized lumber. The old method, which, you know, required time, skill and a certain independence, slowly vanished. But the durability never stopped working. Structures built with this method continued standing, quietly defying the idea that wood must rot. Applying this knowledge today gives survivalists and homesteaders a powerful alternative to chemical treatments. You can use this technique for fence posts that won't decay in wet soil, for tool handles that resist cracking, for outdoor structures that last years longer than pressure-treated lumber, or for waterproof containers that function without plastic. A basic workflow would go like this. Harvest winter-cut wood or select dry heartwood, shape it, burn the surface lightly, brush it clean and finish it with tar oil mixture. Each step builds on the last, creating a composite material of wood, carbon and natural resin that rivals many modern engineered products. This is a technique worth preserving. If you want more deep dives into forgotten knowledge that shaped the ancient and medieval world, make sure you subscribe, share this video, and help bring these lost methods back into practice.